repo market, somebody gets sucked in and crushed. Griffin's liquidity maximization strategy involved being the lender of last resort when the official channels failed. He had carved out a multi-billion-dollar pool of dry powder, pure, unencumbered cash held outside the traditional banking system. When a hedge fund or a mid-cap bank faced a margin call at 3 a.m., Griffin was the only one with the lights on. He didn't want their gratitude, he wanted their prime assets at a 70% discount. Inflation is a predator that eats the slow, Griffin mused. But a liquidity crunch is a predator that eats the overleveraged. If you want to survive the US macro cycle, you have to be neither slow nor leveraged. You have to be the shadow that moves between the cracks. He watched as a major European bank requested a dollar swap line from the Federal. The contagion was crossing the Atlantic. The US dollar was getting stronger against other currencies, but it was getting weaker against reality. This dollar milkshake theory was playing out exactly as he had predicted. The world was scrambling for dollars to pay off debts, driving the price up, even as the dollar itself was losing its internal value. Griffin pulled up a drone feed of downtown San Francisco. The zombie buildings stood tall, beautiful, and 80% empty. The pension funds that owned these buildings were staring at a black hole. The banks that held the mortgages were pretending the valuations hadn't changed. It's a game of musical chairs with 1,000 players and 10 chairs, Griffin said. The music hasn't stopped yet, but the volume is fading. When it stops, the regional banks that fueled the tech boom will realize they are holding ghost towers. And when they fail, they won't just take the tech bros with them, they'll take the local businesses, the municipal bonds, and the tax base. His protection against this specific American tragedy was hyperlocal liquidity. He had moved his capital into the Sun Belt, states with growing populations, sane tax codes, and actual industrial production. He was betting on the internal migration of the United States. He was shorting the ideological debt of the failing coastal cities and going long on the physical reality of the heartland. The macroeconomy is a mirror of national character, Griffin dictated for his memoir. You cannot have a strong currency with a weak social fabric. You cannot have a stable banking system in a polarized society. The dollar is a vote of confidence in the American future, and right now, the world is looking for a different candidate. He closed his eyes for a moment, listening to the hum of the servers. He was the architect of his own island. While the US banking system prepared for a bailout that would only accelerate the inflation, Griffin was already calculating the yield on the next world. He wasn't just surviving the crash, he was designing the recovery. As the afternoon light stretched thin across his desk, Mr. Griffin turned his focus toward the horizon, beyond the US borders. The macroeconomic landscape was no longer just a domestic struggle, it had become a global siege. The BRICS nations were whispering about a gold-backed trade currency, and the petrodollar, the very foundation of American hegemony, was showing structural fatigue. The world is tired of exporting real goods for digital promises, Griffin said, watching the price of Brent crude tick upward. For 50 years, the US banking system exported its inflation to the rest of the world. But the world is sending it back now, with interest. When the mercantilist nations stop recycling their dollars into treasuries, the auction fails. And when the auction fails, the Fed becomes the only buyer in the room. To maximize his liquidity in this shifting world, Griffin had established neutral zone capital pools. He moved significant portions of his firm's liquid reserves into commodities that didn't require a bank's permission to exist. Physical copper, uranium, and energy-dense assets. These were the true, global liquidity, assets that would be settled in whatever currency survived the transition. Protection against inflation isn't about being anti-dollar, Griffin noted, adjusting a silver cufflink. It's about being pro-reality. If the US banking system loses its status as the world's ledger, you don't want to be the one holding the last page of the old book. You want to own the ink and the paper for the new one. Griffin watched a leaked internal memo from a major central bank regarding programmable money, central bank digital currencies, CBDCs. To the public, it was marketed as convenience and faster settlements. To Griffin, it was the ultimate tool for macroeconomic control. A system where the government could instantly penalize saving and force spending to combat a recession. A CBDC is the death of the bank run, Griffin observed dryly. But it's also the death of the exit. If the government can program your money to expire if you don't spend it, or to freeze if your social score dips, then your liquidity is no longer yours. It's a government-granted privilege. His counter-move was the analog reserve. He began diversifying into ghost assets, highly liquid, high-value physical goods that existed entirely outside the digital tracking of the U.S. banking system. Rare industrial components, specialized machinery, and private equity in firms that operated on a barter or closed-loop basis. The more they digitize the cage, the more valuable the physical key becomes, Griffin mused. The American viewer needs to understand that the cashless society isn't about technology, it's about the total surveillance of your purchasing power. In that world, the only true liquidity is the asset that doesn't show up on a screen. The sun was setting, casting long, dark shadows over the Hudson. Griffin looked at the valuation charts for the Magnificent Seven tech giants. They were the last pillars holding up the S&P 500. But even they weren't immune to the gravity of high interest rates. The growth at any cost model was dying, replaced by a desperate search for yield with safety. Silicon Valley built a cathedral on the sand of 0% interest, Griffin said. Now the tide is coming in. When you can get 5% for doing nothing in a money market fund, why would you bet on a biotech startup that won't see a profit for a decade? The U.S. banking system is repricing risk in real time, and it's going to be a violent adjustment. Griffin's macro strategy focused on defensive cash flow. He exited all positions in speculative tech and moved into boring but vital sectors. Waste management, logistics, and food supply chains. These were the companies that could pass inflation directly to the consumer because their products weren't optional. In a crisis, people stop buying iPhones, but they never stop eating, Griffin noted, signing a multi-million-dollar acquisition of a grain processing facility. Maximizing liquidity means owning the assets that everyone else must give you their liquid cash for. That is the ultimate protection. The office was now dark, lit only by the soft glow of the city below and the humming monitors. Mr. Griffin stood by the window, a silhouette of calculated power. He had successfully navigated his firm through the most treacherous macroeconomic waters in a century. He had protected his capital from inflation, leveraged the banking system's weaknesses, and positioned himself to thrive in the aftermath. The system doesn't die with a bang, Griffin whispered, his breath fogging the glass. It dies with 1,000 small compromises. A bailout here, a subsidy there, a little more printing every time the market catches a cold. Until one day, you wake up and realize that the numbers on your screen are just ghosts of a wealth that no longer exists. He picked up his briefcase. His macro survival manual was complete. He had proven that in a world of crumbling institutions and devaluing currencies, the only true security was a sharp mind and a mobile capital base. He was ready for the reset. He was ready for whatever came after the dollar. The game of money is a game of belief, Griffin concluded, heading for the door. And I stopped believing in their system a long time ago. I only believe in the flow. And right now, the flow is leading exactly where I want it to be. The clock on the wall of the private terminal struck midnight. Outside, a sleek Gulfstream sat fueled and ready, its turbines whistling a low, impatient song. Mr. Griffin stood at the edge of the runway, the cold wind of a changing America whipping at his coat. He wasn't fleeing, he was transitioning. The U.S. banking system was entering its dark winter, a period of forced consolidations and government mandates that would turn every private bank account into a de facto public utility. The greatest illusion of the 21st century was the idea that your money in a bank belonged to you, Griffin said to his reflection in the polished fuselage. In a macro crisis, your deposit is just an unsecured loan to an institution that is gambling with your future. True maximization of liquidity means having the keys to your own vault, physically and digitally. He had finalized his new Renaissance portfolio. It was a masterpiece of anti-fragility. He had stripped away every layer of unnecessary counterparty risk. No middlemen, no custodial trust that could be revoked by an emergency decree, and no reliance on the fading ghost of the 60-40 balanced fund. He owned the hard rails of the new economy. Private satellite networks, decentralized energy grids, and high-yield agricultural patents. Inflation is the tax on the silent, Griffin noted, boarding the plane. But for those who speak the language of hard assets and cash flow, inflation is a wind that fills your sails while it sinks the ships of the stagnant. The American viewer needs to stop asking, how do I save, and start asking, what can I own that the world cannot function without? As the jet climbed into the black velvet of the stratosphere, Griffin opened his laptop one last time. He was sending out a final, encrypted briefing to those who had followed his lead. This was the Griffin Manifesto for the post-dollar era. It wasn't a set of stock picks, it was a blueprint for psychological and financial sovereignty in a world of collapsing macros. The US banking system will survive, but it will be unrecognizable, the memo began. It will be a walled garden, highly regulated, and deeply inflationary. To stay liquid within those walls is to accept a slow death. Your goal must be external liquidity, the ability to generate value that is recognized globally, regardless of what the Fed decides in a closed-room meeting in D.C. He emphasized the three pillars of the new reality: velocity, verifiability, and versatility. Velocity: if your capital cannot move across borders in seconds, it isn't liquid, it's a hostage. Verifiability: in an era of deepfakes and shadow accounting, only assets that can be physically or mathematically verified have true value. Versatility: you must be able to pivot your entire operation from one jurisdiction to another without losing more than 10% of your operational capacity. The American dream isn't dead, Griffin whispered, looking down at the flickering lights of the Midwest far below. It's just moving. It's moving away from the debt-laden coastlines and into the hands of those who are brave enough to be their own central banks. The future belongs to the liquid. Part 19, Beyond the Horizon. The plane leveled off at 40,000 feet. The cabin was silent, save for the faint hum of the air filtration system. Mr. Griffin poured himself a glass of water, pure, simple, and essential. He thought about the millions of people waking up to check their banking apps, trusting the numbers they saw on the screen. He felt no pity, only the cold clarity of a man who had seen the math and acted upon it. Protecting yourself from inflation is the easy part, he concluded, closing his eyes. The hard part is protecting yourself from the despair of a crumbling system. But once you realize that a crisis is just a massive reallocation of wealth, the fear vanishes. You stop being a victim of the macro cycle and you become its master. The journey was just beginning. Behind him lay the old world of fractional reserves, hidden fees, and eroding purchasing power. Ahead lay a fragmented, volatile, but incredibly profitable frontier. Mr. Griffin was no longer just a player in the game of money. He had become the architect of a new standard. Control the flow, he murmured as he drifted into a light, calculated sleep. And you control the world.